Should you pay rent? David Jaffe with BestStockStrategy.com. And in this video, I'm going to tell you the best course of action that you can take in order to save money and benefit from the coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic. The landlord is not going to have to be in a situation where they're not collecting rent for 4 or 5 months and they're having a tenant live rent-free, and they might have to incur the litigation risk and the cost of litigation in the future. Now, I know that this video is very different from my usual trading videos, and I know that a lot of people who watch these videos also own properties. I'm not trying to intentionally piss those people off, and I hope that they don't get angry with me, but I just want to share my thoughts and my experiences and what I believe to be the best course of action for those people who are renting properties. Real estate is supposed to be a relatively risky asset. However, over the past 10 or 11 years, landlords in many US cities have been able to benefit from both the capital appreciation of a rising real estate market as well as the cash flow from their tenants. Now, typically what happens is that the cash flow from their tenants will end up paying the mortgage, and then the landlord will end up capturing the equity as the house or apartment complex appreciates in value. However, starting in April, we saw that nearly 1/3 of Americans didn't pay their rent this month. This is from, I believe, CNN. And right now it's September 2020, and my gut feeling is that the data is not going to show a significant improvement on where things were just a few months ago. Additionally, many cities and some states have enacted laws that make it illegal for landlords to evict their tenants. Now, what's happening is that the money that's owed is still going to be owed. However, there is a moratorium on evictions as well as any associated fees that come along with paying your rent late. So, for example, as long as the moratorium is in place, then technically tenants do not have to pay rent because they cannot be evicted. And then once the moratorium ends, then they will owe their landlord a lump sum payment once the moratorium is lifted. Now, obviously, this has a whole host of problems because if someone is not working and then they suddenly owe 4 months of rent, then they're not going to have that money, and then the landlord is probably going to have to settle with the tenant for a lower amount, or the landlord is then going to have to evict the tenant and pay the litigation fees in order to have that tenant evicted. And at the same time, they're not going to be able to collect all of the back months of rent. So here are my thoughts based upon my experience. All right, so my thoughts are on a high level that you can use this time in order to negotiate with your landlord a significant discount on your rent. For example, one of my friends was able to negotiate a 35% decrease in her rent simply by contacting her landlord and telling him that she wants to do the right thing, but at the same time, she is under no financial obligation to pay rent, and she's not working, and she wants to do the right thing, but she was wondering if the landlord can reduce the rent in order to provide her with incentive to pay the rent on time. So the landlord responded that he would cut her rent by 30 to 35% as long as she paid her rent on time. And I think that this is a fantastic strategy for many people to take, where they can contact their landlord and say, hey, we know the situation that's going on where we cannot be evicted, but times are tough right now and we would like to do the right thing. However, because of the current market conditions, we were wondering if you're able to reduce our rent to provide us with additional incentive to pay rent on time. Now, a lot of people would think that this is unethical, but the fact is that the government in this specific situation is protecting renters from being evicted. So simply reaching out to your landlord and asking them for a reduction in the rent could be an easy way for the landlord to decrease their risk because they know that you're actually going to pay rent on time, and it could be a great way for you to realize a reduction in your monthly expenses. I know that one of my best friends, he owns about 10 properties, and he told me that 4 of his tenants are not paying rent. So if you were to assume that 10 properties represented a statistically significant amount, then figure that most landlords have a 40% probability of not collecting rent. As a result, if you offer the landlord a reduction of 30 to 35%, and you also provide them with a certainty that you will pay rent on time, then that is something that I believe many landlords will actually accept. If you decide that you don't want to pay rent and the moratorium is lifted, meaning that during normal times, it would usually take about 2 or 3 months. The problem is that if a landlord were to bring action against you, then there is something called a tenant blacklist. And then if you go to apply to new apartments, then you will show up on a tenant blacklist where many of the larger ones like EQR or Rockrose will not rent to you because it will show up on your tenant screening report that you are on the blacklist. A lot of the screening reports are done by companies such as CoreLogic, and they update their database by going to the landlord tenant hearings and looking at the roster of cases, and then they add the names and the addresses of the people who show up on the case log. So if you end up getting sued by your landlord, then there is a very high chance that you are going to end up on the landlord tenant blacklist, and it would be very difficult for you to secure an apartment in the future. As far as your credit report, I wouldn't worry so much about that. I know that EQR, Equity Residential, does report to the actual credit reporting agencies, and that line item will show up on your credit report. So remember, the credit report is different than the tenant screening report. The tenant screening report is put together by companies such as CoreLogic, SafeRent, whereas your credit reporting agencies are Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. Generally, like I said, it would take about 2 to 3 months for you to get evicted. However, I would highly recommend, and the landlord is also motivated to not litigate these proceedings, and I would highly recommend that you come to an agreement before they actually file a lawsuit against you. Some things to take into consideration are, do you have a family? Are you single? If you're single, then you can obviously afford to be more risk-seeking. As a former landlord, I would actually pay people to leave because it wasn't worth going through the notice to cure, the notice of termination, and filing the proceeding with the courthouse. I think in Arkansas, it is actually criminally illegal to not pay rent, where you can actually get arrested and locked up. But if you're in any of the other 49 states or the District of Columbia, then it is not illegal from a criminal perspective to not pay your rent. Remember that litigation is very expensive. One thing that you might want to do is you can stop paying rent, and then you can wait to see how long it takes for you to receive a notice to cure. Then you can call your landlord and plead poverty and attempt to negotiate a settlement or attempt to negotiate a reduction in your rent. All right, litigation is expensive. As I said previously, I would highly recommend that you call your landlord and attempt to negotiate before you stop paying rent, because the landlord might understand your situation and give you a 30 to 40% reduction as long as you agree to pay your rent on time. If the landlord is unwilling to negotiate with you, then you can stop paying rent. You can wait to see how long it takes for you to receive a notice to cure. You can also check your local laws in your city or your state to see if there is a moratorium on evictions. Now, I believe that landlords can still file the eviction cases. However, what will happen is that the sheriff's office will not actually evict you. Now, this is problematic because, like I said before, if in your specific jurisdiction, the landlords can still process the paperwork and open the litigation and file the petition against you, then you will show up on the landlord-tenant screening report and you will show up on the blacklist. So that is definitely something that you should avoid. However, as I said before, what you can do is you can stop paying rent, and then you can wait to see how long it takes for you to receive a notice to cure. Then what happens is you can wait for the landlord to call you, or you can call them, and then you can plead poverty and attempt to renegotiate the lease, or you can attempt to negotiate a lower amount that you would pay on a monthly basis. Again, look, this is a risk of being a landlord. I mean, it sucks, but real estate is not glamorous. So for all you landlords who are watching this video and you're disgusted about what I'm telling, or you're disgusted about, or what I'm encouraging tenants to do, I'm also notifying tenants of their rights. And more importantly, I'm notifying them of how the process typically unfolds, in that litigation is very expensive. Landlords have had an incredibly easy road over the past 10 years where they've been able to profit from the capital appreciation of the underlying asset, as well as having tenants pay their mortgage for them. But real estate is not glamorous. And for many of you who think that real estate is a path to riches, in my opinion, they are very mistaken. It's an illiquid market with tons of fees and tons of risk. And this is a risk where, as a landlord, if you are unable to initiate eviction proceedings against your tenant, then that is a risk that is inherent to the real estate market. So again, to repeat, I would recommend that as a tenant that you would proactively reach out to your landlord, that you would tell them that times are tough, that money is tight, that you want to do the right thing, and you should try to negotiate about a 40% decrease in your monthly rent. What the landlord can do, if you stop paying rent, if you're unable to come to an agreement, and remember, if you negotiate a 30 to 40% decrease in your monthly rent and the landlord agrees to that, then I would definitely make sure that you get it in writing as an addendum or a rider to your lease, so that way the landlord is not going to come after you later on. If you stop paying rent, even if there's a moratorium in place so that you can't get evicted, it is possible that the landlord can come after you in small claims or civil court, but realistically speaking, that is incredibly unlikely, because especially if you move out of state, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to serve you and initiate an action against you. However, even if you do not move out of state, it's just very unlikely that a landlord would initiate a claim against you in small claims or civil to recoup some of the past rent. What I would also recommend is that you Google if an eviction moratorium is in place for your town, city, or state. And as I've said before, many real estate investors have reaped risk-free gains where they have had capital appreciation and cash flow from their tenants, and investments are supposed to have risk. So again, my recommendation would be that you proactively reach out to your landlord and you try to negotiate a 30 to 40% decrease in your monthly rent. You get it in writing. You then Google whether a moratorium is in place in your town, city, or state. For some reason you can't pay rent, you can potentially gain the upper hand by falling behind by 4 or 5 months, at which time, if you're about 4 or 5 months behind on rent, you can then make an offer to the landlord to settle the outstanding rent for about 2 months of rent as a lump sum payment. Because it is my belief that many people who are 4 or 5 months behind on rent are never going to pay anything even close to the 4 or 5 months that they actually owe. I think that many of the landlords are going to actually settle for about 1/3 of the rent that they are actually owed. And my recommendation to landlords would be that they would proactively and preemptively contact all of their tenants and try to establish a relationship with them and figure out which tenants are going to potentially have problems paying their rent on time. And then the landlords should either try to pay their tenants to leave before the tenants decide to stop paying rent, or the landlords should proactively approach their tenants with a 20 or 30% decrease in their monthly rent in exchange for the tenant paying the rent on time. So again, I would highly recommend that the landlords proactively reach out to all of their tenants and gauge the economic condition and the economic situation of their tenants and identify which tenants they believe are going to have problems paying their rent on time. Then the landlords can proactively try to offer the tenants a 20 or 30% decrease in their monthly rent in exchange for a guarantee that the tenants will pay the rent on time. Another option that the landlord has is that the landlord can proactively pay the tenants $1,000 to $2,000 to vacate the apartment, so that way the landlord is not going to have to be in a situation where they're not collecting rent for 4 or 5 months and they're having a tenant live rent-free, and they might have to incur the litigation risk and the cost of litigation in the future. So I know that from a landlord's perspective, you're probably thinking that there's no way in hell that you're actually going to pay a tenant to leave when the tenant is not paying rent. But I can tell you from firsthand experience that it is much better to rid yourself of a potential headache. And if you believe that a tenant is not going to be able to meet the financial obligations and pay the monthly rent, then you're much better off incentivizing that tenant to leave and paying them $1,000 to $2,000 to vacate the premises, as opposed to incurring the worst case scenario of having the tenant live there rent free, and then you're going to have to initiate an eviction proceeding against them to try to have them vacate the premises. So I know that it's a very tough pill to swallow, but landlords have had very smooth sailing over the past 10 years, where they've realized capital appreciation in the underlying asset, as well as having tenants who are paying their mortgage. So this is just a situation where it's bad luck, but as a landlord, it's all about risk mitigation, and I would pay your tenants to leave. And as a tenant, if you believe that it is going to be difficult for you to pay rent, then I would highly recommend that you proactively and preemptively contact your landlord and try to negotiate a 30 to 40% decrease in your monthly rent, and also make sure that you get it in writing so that way everyone's happy. Because remember, during litigation, the only people who win are the lawyers. As tenants, you want to make sure that you stay off the blacklist, and as landlords, you want to make sure that your tenants do not live there rent free, and you want to reduce your risk of having tenants in there who are unable to pay rent. David Jaffe with BestStockStrategy.com. Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts about this video, and let me know your thoughts regarding whether you as a tenant feel comfortable contacting your landlord and negotiating a 30 to 40% rent decrease, or if you're a landlord, let me know your thoughts on whether you would feel comfortable actually proactively paying your tenant to leave, or whether you would feel comfortable reaching out and assessing the financial condition of your tenants and then proactively paying them to vacate the premises.